And you go, okay, so why would he say it? And you look at the way he moves, outside of his techniques, because when you look at Bujinkan as a Bujinkan system, you've got to have the form. So you've got to go in long stances, you've got to use the evasion ones, you've got to follow through with the blocks and all stuff like that. Unfortunately, being thick and being dyslexic was a nice mix, because I can't, if you show me a three sequence technique, I'll do part of it, and I go, what am I supposed to do next? So I just mumble and fumble. So I think I said, we took us under our wing and said, you don't need to use techniques, you need to use these principles, which was great for me. But I observed him just simply as an observer, but I've been, people don't know, I've done 15 years of karate, and then I saw this guy in 1986 and I went, didn't waste my time here. And it didn't matter what kind of movement, he could have been a ballet dancer for me. I just wanted to move like that. But then I found out he was a katsu practitioner and he thought, right, good. And then rolled on. But all his principles were using this power strength and this way of pressing. But when he gave us that interview in 1995, he described shiatsu not as a system, but a way of, shiatsu in Japanese means to press with your thumb. So he's not saying shiatsu is this or shiatsu is that, because it depends on the level of the practitioner. But what he was saying is, most people press, and that's only a shiatsu. What I'm going to show you is way beyond that. And that's the secret he shared, and you had to move in a certain way, and you had to press in a certain way to achieve it. But when you look at his concepts, and you go, right, natural movement, what's natural movement? So I watch the birds, I watch the fish, I've studied a little bit of anthropology, only the bits that were interesting, because he said you must find these techniques in nature, and study anthropology, put it all together, and start moving this way. So I'm going to go way back a little bit and talk about how dinosaurs move, how alligators move, how fish moves, and what's unique about the human upright spine. And the human upright spine has qualities that don't exist anywhere else in nature. We have a diarthrodial joint at the level of S2 that's been proved by a man called Friedel with dissections. It's listed in Thomas's 10th edition in 1937 book of anatomy. It's not in recent books, but our argument is it does move. It has to move to produce the movement that I'm going to teach. So that's it in a nutshell. So I'm going to look at a gear train, and what a gear train is, I'm going to read it technically, artificial intelligence is a good thing. Where's the gear train? Gear train. The gear train is a collection of toothed wheels and pinions which interact to transfer rotational energy from one location to another. Simple. So, there's me toothed wheels, there's me other toothed wheels, there's me other toothed wheels. Now what happens with the gear train is, and this is how watchmakers make watches, you get one cog that goes around at a certain time, and it drives other cogs in different directions. And you can have those at different sizes, so you can put an hour hand on, and you can put a second hand on, and you can put the minute hand on, and they'll all work the same. And if you were working that in a factory, this could be the water wheel outside. So there's the water wheel outside. You'd have an axle on the water wheel. That would go to another axis that's turning the wheel that's grinding your wheat. So you're making flour inside a windmill. So that's a gear train as well. Now, for a gear train to work in that way, you've got to add something else, because these are all in unison, so they're all in line. So that one turns that one turns that one, and you've got a happy gear train. And when you read anything about anything on the internet, or even artificial intelligence comes up with gear trains, they don't mention them in the body. So you think, well, it's good, makes the clock work, that's fine. How's that going to help natural movement? The second concept we've got to have is these things in the body are moving, but because these are separate entities, like this could be a hip joint and this could be a sacroiliac, your sacrum, one's moving the other in a gear train formation, but they've also got to be held together. So they're held together with fascia and ligaments, so they're one unit. Now in the body there's lots of reciprocal movements. The simplest one we mostly know about is if I take my head and bring it forward, my sacrum goes into counter-nutation. So that's its counterbalance, so that's your pitch. And there's your reverse pitch. And there's your roll, and there's your yaws. So they're all working in unison. If you think about the temporal bone and the zygomatic arch, as the temporal bone goes posterior and medial in its flexion phase, the zygomatic arch comes down and works on the zygoma and opens the zygoma away from the frontal bone and allows room for the maxillary bone. They work on a rotational axis with the spine. So all of these are gear trains. Until you start to look at them and think, gosh, that's a gear train. So if that's asymmetrical, something like the volar could be out of sync, giving you problems with the eye or something of that nature, and that's why we've got to straighten all these up. So there's your gear trains. Then they're all joined together, so that's coupling. Now when we look in the body in a tensegrity way, things will be what, maybe. So many years ago, we brought Stephen Levin to talk to us about tensegrity, and he came to York, and he blew our minds with the concept that all of a sudden I understood that you can float if you walk, because tensegrity makes it possible. And prior to tensegrity, we just had weight bearing. So you've got structures and buildings that are weight bearing. Then a man called something Fuller. Buckminster Fuller, thanks Joe. Buckminster Fuller. He used to design buildings, and he used to design various structures that were totally tensegrous. One day in his garden he made a mast. So if you imagine a pylon, electric pylon, the height of a pylon, on its side, reaching over like that, without the point touching the floor. So it was doing that. And it was massive, it was about 150 foot. And it was totally counterbalanced, so all of the weight was going back to the interface, which is the connection to the floor. So it wasn't bolted or secured at all. So the whole structure just pushed back, and there was the interface, and the interface is wherever it contacts the floor. Our body is also a total tensegral unit, and so this is a representation of a spine made by Jill? Tom Fleming. Thanks. And this is to represent the spine. When I first got it, it was so highly tensioned here that if you squeezed any of these elastics, the top would also move. So this represents the sacrum, and this is the occiput end. And basically, you can't have one part of the spine moving without the whole. So when we look at a snake, or we look at a fish, or you look at a horse, to me that's a horse's spine, with the head on the end, and 4 legs underneath. And because it's a quadruped, it can have its feet in any sort of arrangement, whether it's walking, cantering, trotting, galloping. And as those feet are arranging, what it's doing is distributing the weight across its being. But also, because it's changing its legs, the iliac bone, which is not diaphrodial in a horse, so that it lifts up on one side and lifts up with the other. Whichever leg is going back over to produce a long lever arm, and that puts a rotational torque in the horse's lumbar vertebra, and we'll talk about rotational torque later, and the head at the other end with the nuchal ligament make this into something that just undulates like this. And the horse at gallop actually leaves the ground. So you can imagine a horse weighing half a ton off the ground. A cheetah, 90% of the time when it's running, is off the ground. So they're actually floating mechanisms using undulation and rotational torque, and the legs just simply for just where the direction they're going. And then we turn that upright, and it becomes our spine, which supersedes the spine any measure. So the very basic form of movement that you've got is in a fish, if we all evolved from the sea. And on a fish you've got a sort of a spine, but it's made of gristle and cartilage, it's not bone. And the muscles are arranged on either side, and so it's just got a muscle down one side and one muscle down the other side. So when it wants to swim, it simply contracts one side of its body. The other side's concave, one side's convex. And then it does the opposite. And because of its scales, as the water, as it's moving forward, also because of its shape, as it moves forward, the water turbulates behind its scales and actually provides propulsion. And the rudder, which is its tail, also makes it go off. So all it can do is contract one side of the body and the other side of the body to produce a bending in water, which is undulation. You want to come out the water, so we look at something like an alligator. So an alligator also uses undulation, but its legs like right angles like this. So its femur comes straight out from the body, and the tibia goes straight down. So it's like that and like that. So what it does, if it wants to walk, is it picks one of them up. And when it picks it up, it rotates the iliac bone forward. And that puts a rotational bend on the spine, which is an undulation. And when it puts it back down again, it's in front of where it was before. So it's like pivot and dropping, pivot and dropping, pivot and dropping. But even using that method, it can run at about 35 miles an hour. So if you can only run at 20, keep away from alligators, because you wouldn't think they could run that fast, but they can. So that's a different kind of motion, still requiring undulation. When we come to the human spine, we've got different choices, and a few people tried in the past to become upright and didn't make it. You know, Neanderthal was one of them. I'm the last remnant of Neanderthal. But there are a few other breeds that didn't quite make it. That showed evidence of a diarthrodial joint on X-rays and old fossils and things, but they didn't quite make it. We're the only ones that really made it, Homo sapien. We became upright and had a unique spine. But what was unique, mostly in the anthropological sense, was that if you look at a chimpanzee or a gorilla or an orangutan can be upright in a tree, but it can't be upright on the ground, so it's the nearest, but it can't go far. Gorillas lean forward a bit. Chimpanzees can run a bit and drop down, because mostly their muscles are all designed for flexing. So if you're in a tree, I want flexors. So I've got very strong flexors that flex my hips, make me jump. I've got a nice prehensile tail. That's battery balancing act, and that all works the spine as well. So what happens in a chimpanzee is that on the fifth lumbers, they have stylus processes that actually point forwards. And they form embryologically, when we're born, they form with the ribs. So at a very early stage, they form with the ribs. Our transverse process forms much later in the embryological stage, which is important as part of the story. But there's the two, can I have some water please? There's the two styloid processes pointing forwards. And they have a muscle called the longus, which is a flexor. It's a very strong flexor, so when they want to flex, they can jump and leap in trees. Somewhere in time, and there's no transitional date with this, with fossil evidence, the human bipeds didn't have the styloid process longus muscle. What happened was, that didn't form, and the transverse process formed on the back part of the pedicle of the vertebra, because we wanted an extensor. And so the longus muscle spun around and became an extensor on a human and a flexor on a chimpanzee. And the reason for that is that we needed to have a 35-degree angle on our sacrum and a lordosis of the 5 lumbar vertebrae, and that muscle helps to do that. And then part of this mechanism that I'll go into later is what we do with that curve when it's established. The other thing on humans is that our femur heads, on an ape or chimpanzee, the femur head is like this in the socket and the legs are straight down. And on a human, they came further back and round and changed shape in the spheroidal shape of the acetabulum and angled inwards, because our feet has 3 arches which work differently as well. So we'll go through that as well when we're looking at all of this motion. And we developed much stronger posterior femoral ligaments to maintain also this lordosis in the lumbar spine, which is really, really important for our locomotion. So that's the difference between the different animals, bipedal, quadrupeds, chimpanzees and humans. So we have a lumbar spine that's got a nice lordosis in it. We've got better femoral heads for keeping us upright bipedally, and we've got modified ligaments at the back of the posterior holding these femur heads in place. The sacral angle is about 30 to 35, some people say 30, some 35, I won't argue. And we have 4 curves in the spine, but basically we talk about 3, because they also consider this a curve. But really we're talking about these 3 curves. So we've got the cervical red, blue for thoracic, red for lumbars, and this is the most important area. So again, when an alligator wants to run, it's got to bend, and a lot of other lizards and things like that, other mammals, have to bend in the middle. So there's a critical point where they bend, and they've got to be able to have respiration when they run. So what they ended up having anthropologically was a fixed rib cage, so that the lungs didn't move around so much, and they've got a diaphragm. So on an alligator, the diaphragm actually pulls the liver. Not the diaphragm, the liver has a ligament that pulls it down, the muscle that pulls it down out of the way of the diaphragm, so it can breathe faster when it's running. We've got a modified diaphragm, so we've overcome that problem as well. But it meant that you've got a thorax that turns, and that's pretty fixed, so you've got a respiratory that's looked after, you've got free hands, you've got legs that are upright, so now we're up and we can move around. But D12, where the last rib is, the bottom of the rib cage, is very crucial for movement, because that's going to rotate the thorax and reciprocally on the pelvis. So again, we have a gear train existing between the thorax and the pelvis, one moving in one direction, one moving in the other, like this, counter-torquing. And again, that produces rotary torque in the lumbars to produce turbine power to the spine. And that's basically how we move. So when we're on the floor with our 3 arched feet, that's the start of a gear chain. And then the tibia and the talus is the most established heterokinetic joint. Right. Heterokinetic. Who's going to define heterokinetic for me? New word, great.
Just took you back to an exam question there, right?
You're all hot and sweaty.
Yeah, I think I got it.
You said more question.